My wife, Annie, just died. My father told me to marry another woman like her. Has this started a war between us? I'm 26. I lost Annie over a year ago. When our two children were only 18 months and 4 years old. She was only 25. Annie and I had 2 children, and at that time, they were just 18 months and 4 years old, almost exactly the same age I was when I lost my mother. Losing my mother, the parallel was frightening. It forced me to face the full circle of my life. I was only 5 when she died. That memory isn't just a single moment, it's like a shadow that stretched over my entire childhood. Everything seemed a bit grayer, a bit dimmer. Without her, the house was quieter, and Dad was always busy trying to fill the void her absence left. He did his best in every aspect of our lives, but you could tell he was just as lost in grief as I was, even though he tried to hide it behind long working hours and forced smiles at dinner. I remember feeling confused, too. When our family friends talked about their mothers and their Mother's Day plans, it felt like I was in a world where everyone else had something precious that I'd lost. Birthdays and holidays were the hardest. Dad really tried, but there's a special kind of emptiness that comes from missing someone who should have been there for those moments. As I grew older, that confusion turned into a deep-seated fear of loss. I either clung too tightly to relationships or shied away from them to avoid potential heartbreak. It wasn't until much later, in my adult relationships, that I began to understand the depth of this fear. Therapy helped me talk about it. Losing my mother so young fundamentally shaped who I am. It made me more empathetic to others' pain and more aware of life's fragility. Even without her, the world suddenly seemed bigger and more intimidating. Although I was too young to comprehend all the ways her passing would affect me, I felt her absence in every part of my life. There was an emptiness at home, a silence that wasn't just about the lack of her voice but also the missing layer of love and security she represented. Annie always had this vivid memory of her father holding her up high above his head, making her feel like she could touch the clouds. But he was taken from her by a sudden illness when she was 6. This loss left a deep, aching void in her life, shaping her in ways she sometimes didn't even realize. She grew up determined to be the pillar her father couldn't be, to build a fortress of love for our family that nothing could penetrate, not even death. But life, as it often does, had other plans. It was a crisp fall morning, like any other, except Annie wasn't feeling well. At first, we thought little of it, hoping it was just a passing cold. But it turned out to be much more serious. Within months, we were confronted with the reality that reflected her deepest fears. Annie had been diagnosed with a terminal illness, the kind that sneaks up quietly but quickly overwhelms in those final months. Annie's determination to create lasting memories with our children became everything. Every day, despite her diminishing strength, she would spend time with them, reading stories, playing games, or just holding them, making sure her presence was felt in their lives the way she hoped it would be. She often spoke to me late at night, her voice a mixture of determination and desperation about her need to leave them a legacy of love, to be there in their hearts and minds when she could no longer be there in person, which she so desperately wanted. She was determined to break the cycle of loss that had overshadowed her childhood, to give our children the stable, loving foundation she had lost so early on. Her greatest fear was repeating history and leaving our children with the same empty memories and unanswered questions she had struggled with. As I watched Annie with our children, saw the lengths she would go to pour love into their young lives, she would make videos for them, leave little notes in unexpected places, and create traditions that would live on in her absence. Her creativity in weaving these threads of connection was both inspiring and heartbreaking when she died. The loss was monumental, echoing the emptiness of her own childhood, but also filled with the richness of the love she had poured into every moment with them. Annie had always had a clear vision of her own funeral. It was something we talked about occasionally. Those strange, somber conversations that pop up unexpectedly and linger between a couple. She wanted it to be more of a celebration of her life than a morning of doom and gloom. She'd say, half joking but serious about the essence of her wishes, make it a day where everyone can remember the happy times, with lots of flowers and maybe even some fireworks. When it happened, I was plunged into a deep grief that was hard to navigate. It was filled with the pain of loss but also the duty to honor her final wishes. The day of her funeral came on a bright and clear morning that felt almost uncomfortable in the context of our loss, yet fitting for the kind of goodbye she had envisioned. The service was held at our church, a place she had chosen not only for its spiritual significance but also for its beautiful stained glass windows and the way the sunlight danced through them. It was as if she was still there in the morning, under the vibrant colors. Friends and family gathered, not in black but in bright colors, as she had requested. Flowers adorned every surface. Her favorite wildflowers, in vibrant blues, yellows, and reds, created a tapestry of color that transformed the church into a place alive with memory and love. The air was filled with their favorite music, a mix of classic rock and folk tunes, songs that had soundtracked our life together. Each melody stirred memories and brought smiles, even through the tears after the service. We moved to a nearby park, a place Annie loved. As people shared their stories of Annie, her quirks, her laughter, her boundless energy, the mood lightened. It felt like she was with us in the laughter and shared memories. As the sun began to set, we prepared for the final act of the day, the fireworks. It was an unconventional choice, but it was exactly what she had wanted. As the first rocket shot into the sky and exploded in a cascade of color, it felt like a release, a letting go of some of the sadness and a celebration of a spirit too vibrant to ever really be gone. Each explosion was a reminder of her vibrant life, a punctuating finale that she would have loved. Now, as I watch our children grow, I see Annie's influence in their resilience, their laughter, and even in their tears. They often talk about her, recalling moments I hadn't even noticed. It's clear that while life took Annie too soon, her efforts to be a present, loving force in their lives were not in vain. She lives on through them, through the stories we share and the love we give. As their father, my role has evolved to not only nurture them but to uphold the essence of what Annie wanted for them, a sense of security, love, and the knowledge that they were and always will be valued, no matter what life throws our way. Now when I look at my own children, I see the same confusion and loss reflected in their eyes as they search for Annie in simple moments, like when they tie their shoelaces or need comfort after a bad dream. I know these feelings, I live them. It's a reminder of how deeply a child feels the absence of a parent, often in ways they can't fully express. Sharing this experience has deepened my empathy and understanding of my children's emotions. I find myself navigating their grief while dealing with my own, trying to be the rock they can lean on. It's not just about providing for them materially but making sure they feel safe and loved, that they have space to miss their mom without feeling like they have to hide their grief. Her journey through loss has also changed my approach to parenting. I'm more patient, more attuned to the unspoken parts of their grief, and more proactive about our emotional health as a family. We talk about Annie often, keeping her memory alive, not as a shadow hanging over us but as a light that continues to guide us. I strive to be present in a way that I felt my father struggled to be after my mother died. I watched my children deal with their loss, and I understand the long road ahead of them. I know the challenges they'll face as they grow up without their mother, but I also see their resilience, and that gives me hope. It reminds me that while the pain of loss never completely disappears, it can be woven into the fabric of our lives, making us stronger. I've promised myself to be there for them, to help them through this journey and to ensure that they never doubt that they are both loved by their mom, whose love lasts beyond her absence, and by me, who will be with them every step of the way. After my mom passed, the house felt suspended in time, with remnants of her life tucked away. Her clothes still hung in the closet, her books remained on the shelves, and the air carried the gentle scent of her perfume. This stillness, this preserved world of hers was abruptly shattered when my father announced that he was remarrying. It had been barely a year since we had lost her. We'd lost her, and the news hit me like a cold wave. Ellen moved in shortly thereafter. After the wedding, she brought with her boxes of new things, new routines, and a new presence that seemed to flood the rooms my mother had once occupied. Attempts to reorganize the house, from the living room to replacing the curtains my mother had chosen, felt less like changes and more like erasures of the life we had lived. Ellen was kind, or at least she tried to be. She cooked meals she thought I would like and made small talk, trying to bridge the gap between us, but her efforts felt forced. Every kind gesture, no matter how well-intentioned, felt like an intrusion, as if she was trying to sew herself into the fabric of a family portrait where she didn't belong. I resisted, not out of spite for her as a person but out of a deep-seated loyalty to my mother's memory and a child's grief that clung stubbornly to the past. The tension was palpable. My reactions to Ellen's changes ranged from quiet withdrawal to outright defiance. I would put things back where Mom had left them, insist on using the same old dishes instead of the new ones Ellen brought, and avoid spending time in the newly redecorated rooms. I missed the familiarity of my old life, the comfort of knowing that every corner held a piece of my mother. My father, caught between his attempt to move forward and his child's resistance, often became frustrated. Arguments became more frequent. Often he would accuse me of not giving Ellen a fair chance. I saw it differently. I felt he was erasing my mother's legacy, urging me to forget rather than remember. One particularly heated evening, my father snapped after he found me restoring the living room back to its original state. "We can't live in a museum," he yelled. "To move on, you have to move on, but how? How could I go on?" Mom's shadow was in every laugh that echoed through these rooms, in every step I took, in the furniture she had carefully chosen, in every scent that lingered in the house. It increasingly felt like a battlefield where every change to its old state felt like a loss, a reminder of how suddenly and ruthlessly life could change. Ellen, caught in the middle, gradually stopped trying so hard to win me over and instead retreated into whatever piece of comfort she could find with my father. During those first few months after Ellen moved in, the atmosphere in our home became increasingly tense. I was still struggling with the loss of my mother and often found solace in old photos and memorabilia that kept her memory alive. My vulnerability and frequent outbursts of grief were a stark reminder of the raw pain that lingered in our home. It was during this time that Dad's attitude toward me changed drastically. The few times I showed vulnerability or cried for Mom, he responded not with comfort but with frustration. He would yell at me and tell me to grow up and stop crying. It was clear he was dealing with his own pain, but his approach left me feeling abandoned in my grief. One night after he found me crying in my room with a picture of Mom, he barked, his voice echoing off the walls, "You need to grow up and stop crying all the time." To me, his push to make me resilient felt more like a rejection. I looked up at him, my heart sinking. "I miss her, Dad," I managed to get the words out, barely a whisper. "Why can't you just let me miss her?" His next words were like a cold knife. "I'm happier now and you should be too. I love Ellen more than ever." "I loved your mother," he said with a certainty that seemed to seal the growing divide between us. The room fell silent, save for the quiet sobs I couldn't hold back. Those words, harsh and raw, sliced through the fragile thread of our relationship. I felt not only the loss of my mother but also the creeping loss of my father, who was now a stranger, driven by his own grief and newfound happiness. Those words, harsh and raw, wounded me more than the tears I shed for Mom. As the years passed, the emotional distance grew. He was increasingly absent, not only physically but emotionally. My cries for attention, for the affection I so desperately missed, went unanswered. His priorities had shifted, and I felt an unwelcome reminder of a past he wanted Ellen to forget. Her efforts could never bridge the gap. Between Dad and me, it felt like a betrayal, not only of Mom's memory but also of the father-son bond we should have had. Abandoned and misunderstood, I withdrew into myself. The isolation at home led me to seek solace elsewhere, in books, school activities, anywhere I could find a semblance of the care and attention I lacked. But the effects of those formative years lingered. I harbored a deep-seated distrust of relationships, afraid of loving someone only to be left behind one day, of being deemed unworthy of their continued presence. Looking back as an adult, I see that Dad dealt with his grief in his own flawed way. While understanding his pain now, it does little to ease the resentment and hurt I felt as a child, left behind in the wake of his choices. Now, facing my own challenges as a widower, I am determined to be the father my children need, the one I wished I'd had at their age. One who is present, supportive, and unconditionally loving, no matter what life throws our way. After Annie died, Dad reached out, suggesting I move on and cut him some slack. I didn't respond at the time, I was still mired in grief. Today, the pain remains raw, but I'm in therapy, seeking peace. He contacted me a few more times, apologizing for his initial message. A few days ago, at his request, we met in a quiet cafe, a neutral ground seemingly apt for the tense discussion that loomed. As I sat across from him, still wearing my wedding ring, a stark symbol of my ongoing grief, it didn't take long for the conversation to veer into uncomfortable territory. He noticed the ring almost immediately and took it as a cue to press his point about moving on. "You can't keep living in the past," he said. "It's time to think about your future. Maybe start meeting people." I clenched my jaw, the old frustration simmering anew. I asked him to drop the subject, but he persisted, perhaps believing he was acting in my best interest. That's when he brought up his own past, his hasty remarriage after Mom's death. Not for the first time, but this time with explicit emphasis on how his new wife had brought him happiness, something he thought I needed too. "I think you do, too," he said earnestly. "I thought you'd understand by now. Especially when the children need a mother figure." His words stung. It wasn't just the suggestion of replacing Annie, it was the implication that my grief was a selfish indulgence I should discard for the children's sake. He went further, hoping I'd eventually see the benefits of his choices, that I'd let go of my resentment and realize that embracing someone new wasn't a betrayal of my late wife. I told him firmly that it wouldn't work. Grief isn't something you can just turn off to make room for someone else. It doesn't operate on a convenient timeline, I said, and I could see the frustration mirrored on his face. You think I hate you for being happy with her, I continued, but it's not about that. It's about how you handled everything after Mom died. How you seemed to erase Mom's memory as if it were the only way to be happy again. Maybe he didn't grasp how deeply his actions had wounded me. Perhaps he'd never considered that his pursuit of happiness had left a trail of pain in its wake. Our conversation grew heated, our voices rose, drawing suspicious glances from others. The air was thick with tension as we reached a fragile point. His earlier remarks about moving on and finding new love had pushed me to the brink. When I challenged his views on grief and moving on, he paused, looking genuinely puzzled. How could you expect to find someone else to love you and the children if you're still hung up on Annie? He asked, his voice tinged with concern and a hint of frustration. To me, it felt like an accusation. Annie was the love of my life, I replied, my voice unwavering. Love doesn't end when someone dies. You don't just replace a person like that. I could see him struggling to process my words, his eyes searching mine for a glimmer of the sun he once knew, the one not shattered by loss. I went on, my children are my heart, Dad. They're the other loves of my life. But it's different, they don't rely on me just for love. I have to give them security, safety, and a sense of normalcy in a world turned upside down. The cafe's ambient noise faded as I leaned in slightly. It's my job, my duty, to give them the best life I can. That doesn't mean rushing to fill a void with a new person. It means being there for them, undistracted and unwavering. He was stunned, perhaps by the intensity of my conviction or the realization that our perspectives on grief were worlds apart. But you need someone too, he finally murmured, almost to himself, a note of sadness in his voice. I needed my dad when I lost my mom, I shot back, pain and defiance lacing my words. Instead, I got a man who was too quick to move on. I won't do that to my children. I won't let them feel secondary to someone else's happiness. By the end of our coffees, now cold and bitter, mirroring the mood at our table, Dad was about to offer more advice on how I should live my life. I cut him off, unleashing years of pent-up frustration and pain. I need to make this clear, I began, my voice calm but laden with emotion. I will never tell my children to just get over their mother's death. I won't sit them down and say their mother is dead and they have to accept a new mother. In this cafe, where the usual clinking of cups and indistinct chatter had fallen silent, I held his gaze. Around us, Dad watched me, his expression hardening as he readied to defend his actions. But I wasn't done. And I'm not going to scold them for missing her, for crying for her. They're children. They lost their mother. How could I possibly take their grief and make it about someone else's discomfort? They need a father who understands their pain, not one who dismisses it. Dad shifted uncomfortably, his eyes dropping briefly to the table before meeting mine again. You think, he mumbled, his voice a mix of defensiveness and weariness. I think you forgot when it mattered, I retorted, unable to temper the edge in my voice. You remarried so quickly, and it felt like you were trying to erase Mom from our lives. And you expected me to be okay with all the changes because you were. Well, I'm not trying to find you a new mother. What I want is to be the best dad I can be, given the difficult hand we've been dealt. I want to give them stability, love, and understanding, not rush to fill a perceived void with the first person who comes along. My heart pounded with the force of my conviction. And I will never make them feel second to anyone, like you made me feel. You made it clear that you loved your new wife more, and I felt like I had lost you. Not just Mom, he finally said, something like regret coloring his tone. Maybe someday you'll understand. But as I walked out of that cafe, I knew understanding wasn't just about seeing his point of view. It was about recognizing the chasm between us and how we each processed loss. I wasn't ready to forgive his past actions just because he'd found happiness. Our paths were different, and I needed him to respect that, without judgment or pressure. The weight of our fractured relationship felt heavier than ever. I realized some rifts might be too wide to bridge, at least for now. In the weeks that followed, he tried texting a few times, leaving voicemails. His voice always held that familiar blend of concern and awkwardness, as if he wasn't quite sure what to say or how to say it. Every attempt to mend the gap reminded me of how vast it had grown over the years. I responded sparingly, brief and noncommittal, until finally, I stopped altogether. It wasn't a peaceful decision, but it felt necessary. Life marched on, filled with the daily grind of raising 2 children alone. I threw myself into being a dad, soccer games, school projects, bedtime stories. Each smile and tear from my children reminded me of my promise to be their steady anchor. I often reflected on my conversations with Dad, turning his words over in my mind. I questioned the harshness of my responses, the rigidity of my stance. Yet each time I considered reaching out, I remembered the loneliness of being a child who felt second best, and I'd retreat, convinced I needed more time. Months rolled into a year, the seasons changed, and so did the kids. They grew taller, their faces shedding the last traces of toddlerhood. Dad's attempts at contact became a distant memory, as faded as the happier times before Mom's death. On a chilly evening, the kind that heralds winter's approach, I climbed into the attic to sort through dusty old boxes. The attic, with its musty scent and moonlight seeping through the small openings, always felt like a time capsule, untouched and brimming with secrets. As I sifted through the boxes, my hands landed on an old photo album, its cover slightly faded. Curiosity piqued, I sat on an old rickety chair, the album in my lap. When I opened it, I was greeted by vivid snapshots of Mom and Dad in their youth. They were full of life and laughter, captured in moments of picnics in the park, beach outings, vacations, and quiet afternoons at home. Each photo was a gateway to a bygone era. Grief had reshaped our family, but looking at these pictures of Dad with his carefree smile, I realized how much I missed him. Not just his physical presence, but the essence of the man he'd been before tragedy had transformed him. The contrast with his later years was painfully sharp, and a wave of nostalgia washed over me, softening the edges of my long-held resentment. It wasn't just Mom I mourned, I missed the father he'd once been. It dawned on me how profoundly grief had altered him, stealing the joyful person from our lives and replacing him with someone I could scarcely recognize, let alone understand. Surrounded by relics of my childhood in the attic, I felt the burden of years of misunderstandings and misconnections. The memories of laughter and love in those photos seemed at odds with the tense, awkward encounters of recent years. But this realization was a quiet yet profound turning point. Perhaps there was room for reconciliation. A chance to rediscover the man in those pictures, to understand his journey. It was time to bridge the gap that grief had widened, to view him not only as the man whose choices I'd struggled to forgive but as my father, who had once meant the world to a younger me. Closing the album, a plan took shape. I would reach out to him, attempt a conversation, one not centered solely on what had gone wrong but also on what had once been right. It felt daunting, fraught with potential pain but also ripe for healing. As I descended from the attic, leaving the haven of the past behind, I was ready to face whatever came next. Armed with newfound understanding and a hopeful heart, I considered how the children would remember these years. Would they see a father who stood firm in his principles or one who let old wounds dictate the future? The thought unsettled me, enough to consider that maybe it was time for a different approach. Not for my sake, but for the children's, who deserved to know all aspects of their family, even the complex ones. The next morning, I drafted a simple yet more open message to Dad than any I'd sent in ages. "Read it when you're ready," I wrote. I wasn't sure where a conversation would lead us or if it would heal all wounds. It might still hurt, but I knew it was a start, a small step toward understanding, or at least peaceful coexistence in this new chapter of our lives. As the silence I'd grown accustomed to now seemed a bit less intimidating, tinged with the possibility of something new.